So take it away, Brendan. Let's see if I can hand this off.
Yeah, I think you did it. Hey, John, thanks. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We have a really great panel today. We're going to be talking about the future of sports storytelling. And when I think of the future of sports storytelling, I think of digital sports. And there's four major players in the game right now, at least as far as what I think are the most important, most valuable. It's Barstool Sports, House of Highlights, Overtime, and Instagram. And it just happens that we have four people here from four of those companies. So, guys, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it. You did a quick round of introductions just real fast. So we have Deirdre Lesser, Chief Revenue Officer at Barstool Sports. We have Drew Muller, who is the Director of Strategy and Operations at House of Highlights. We have Mark Cohn, who's the Chief Content Officer at Overtime. And last but not least, we have the man with the greatest title on the planet, Head of Sports at Instagram. Guys, we can agree that Dave has the best title ever. Right? Yeah, I think so.
The title is great. The role can be very unglamorous at times. I promise you that.
Sure, I'm sure. Okay, guys, let's get started. And I appreciate everybody being here. So when we think about the future of sports storytelling, we often think about how do we engage the next generation of fans. And Deirdre, I'll start with you. Because I think Barstool probably knows its fan base better than anyone. And maybe that's because when Dave Portnoy started the company, he had such a strong voice and unapologetic as it is. Dave Portnoy graduated from the University of Michigan, by the way, so go Blue. Deirdre, can you just talk to us a little bit about why and how Barstool has been able to engage that next generation or younger fan base with its content and with its voice?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, hi, Brendan and everyone else, Dave, Drew, Mark on the panel. It's great to see you guys again. I think, yes, we are one of the best at engaging young audience. For anyone who's listening in and maybe doesn't know us as well, Barstool Sports is a top 10 distributed media company in the U.S. currently. Big focus on sports, obviously, that's our name, but also very much focused on sports, lifestyle, pop culture, and entertainment. So we've really broadened kind of the topics we cover and the way we cover it, and the voice and tone of our personalities is very much fan to fan, peer to peer. I think that is the thing that separates us from the mainstream, particularly in the sports genres, mainstream media, is that, we're really fans speaking to fans in an authentic tone and a voice that they recognize and speak to one another in. And I think that the word authenticity, as overkill, buzzwordy as it is really something that we are very, very, committed to maintaining. And I think that that's something that has continued to separate us from, again, that mainstream sports media kind of talking heads type of content and coverage.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it feels like broadly across these four, or at least these three properties, and then Instagram. That's the case. Drew, I want to go to you quickly because you House of Highlights started off similarly with one voice with Omar, right? And so with Omar no longer being there, how have you been able to maintain that strong voice for that young culture, and at the same time you're owned by Turner? So how are you able to balance those two things and continue to maintain that authenticity and voice?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think for us, it's really been the focus on the packaging of content and the selection of content and making sure that it always stays core to the actual purpose of House of Highlights as a platform. And that's to deliver Gen Z audience everything that they want to see in sports and youth culture. So, whether it was one person, crafting the voice early on, and then as that expanded, as the brand grew up older and older, I think, when you have core values and you have a certain way that you approach content, I think that comes across no matter who's kind of behind the scenes choosing what content goes up or choosing the caption on a given day. I think that's what's been the most, salient part of House of Highlights in its, 3-4 year history so far, is that it's not just one person behind the handle. It's really a sentiment of how you select and then position and package content. So as Deirdre said, it's really the aspect of authenticity, but I would also say relatability, and making sure that anytime we're bringing content or selecting content for the audience, that it comes across like it's something that one of your best friends would have sent to you, and it's positioned in a way that feels normal and casual and not like it's trying too hard. That's reflected, from the great programming team that we've always brought on. But I think what goes into that is making sure we're bringing people in that reflect the sentiment that the Gen Z audience has, and making sure that it's programmed by the people that we hope to consume it. I think always comes across, and that's kind of the driving function day in and day out.
That's the captioning, I think, is I follow everybody here on Instagram. It's my main sort of consumption mechanism for all the brands. That caption it comes across every single time. The same with Barstool. Mark, I want to go to you for a second, because Overtime is a very interesting philosophy around content and programming. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, right now we have 20 to 25 shows that are in production, and we always have 20 to 25 shows that are in production. And what's a little bit different about us is that we're really hyper-focused on character development and narrative storytelling. And our programming is also generally runs 15 minutes plus compared to a lot of digital publishers that are in the 1 minute to 5 minute range with a lot of the content that they're creating. Drew said something interesting about, programming using, Gen Z to program the House of Highlights channel. And I think of it similarly in that I have a lot of millennials and Gen Z who are creating my content, whether that is on camera or whether that is the editors, producers, or shooters that are in the field. These are digital natives, right? And so when we're able to use digital natives to be able to go out and tell narrative-based storytelling about the people and the teams that they care about most, the trick that the internet has that television does not have is it has such great data from the perspective of understanding who does the audience engage with the most, right? If you're a television station or even a sports writer, you're kind of like in the air of like, hey, should we cover this? Basically, and everything defaults to like, let's cover LeBron, but they never kind of go a layer deeper to figure out who are the people and who are the stars that these 17-year-olds really love to consume a lot of. And also, they're not using all of the retention charts that tell you how to edit a video. So we coach these young producers and editors to be able to edit videos in a way that makes sense for this next generation of sports fans. And, when you really look into it, one of the things that we hold up really high is right now there's been 3,800 videos of an hour or more posted to YouTube by sports publishers. Number one and number two most viewed video on YouTube over an hour by sports media publishers are Overtime videos. And that's something that we take a lot of pride in. And it's honestly no wonder why, 25 million more people over the next 5 years will cut their cord.
What's really interesting about what we've got some commonality here is that we have people who consume the brand producing content for the brand in each instance. And Dave, so I want to kick it over to you because you spend a lot of time with the leagues and the teams and the broadcasters. I want to know, who do you think who's doing it well in terms of reaching the next generation, and how are they doing it well?
Yeah, I think there's a reason you've assembled this panel, and it's because everyone on this panel represents an organization that does this really well. And I think there are a couple of through lines that I feel are constant with the three brands that are on this panel, as well as a few other broadcasters and leagues. And I think generally speaking, they are highly relatable and relatable to their fan base. And I think that relatability is in a number of different ways, whether it's the talent that is in front of the camera, who doesn't feel like they are, a retired Hall of Famer who the very few people in the audience could ever aspire to be. This is the Overtime Larry and Chloe's. These are the Dave Portnoy's. These are the ones who look and feel like us and feel like we can aspire to be them, or at least understand and relate as to who they are. I think all of these brands on stage, or this virtual stage, do a great job of not just broadcasting to their fan base, but actually build communities. I know there was a great article written up about Overtime and how they've done a very unique job of building community, but that can look and feel in a number of different ways and really bring those fans into the experience, whether it's curating UGC, whether it's having that sort of two-way dialogue. You mentioned, I think it was Drew who mentioned sort of the captions and how they speak to their fans. At times, it looks and feels like an entirely different language than what I'm probably accustomed to. I would venture to say that, unfortunately, the social rooms at Barstool over time and House of Highlights are probably skewing younger in age than I think any of the four of us or five of us. But there's a reason for that, and it's because there is a way to communicate with those fans that feels unique and specific. And again, I think that is a nuance that other brands need to spend more time thinking about as well. If you look at the league side, there are organizations that everyone recognizes, like the NBA, who have done a great job of being athlete-centric, which is a huge interest point on Instagram for young people. But they've also gone so far, and the NFL specifically has gone so far as to partner with Instagram to actually create a Playmakers program that brings young digital natives, to use Mark's term, into their organization spiritually and help them produce content for their channels. So you've got young people creating for young people. And so I think, again, to use that term that Deirdre referenced is probably overused, that authenticity. What better way to do that than by actually having the voice and tone of what you're producing be produced by the very people who actually are more inclined to consume that.
That's great. Quickly, everybody who's in the audience, feel free to ask questions. We'll have a sort of a 10-minute at the end of our discussion to have the panel answer questions. I want to go to sports culture in terms of programming. And Deirdre, I'll go to you. Obviously, you don't have highlight rights, which is a traditional way in which you tell sports stories, right? Highlights and commentary. You guys have taken that to a different level. You spoke about it briefly. Obviously, we have the pizza review show. We have a cooking show. How do you guys think about gambling? Is obviously something that's become very huge for Barstool. How do you guys think about that additional programming outside of just like talking about the sports themselves?
Yeah. So one thing that I just want to, like, listening to this panel, and I mentioned it when we had our prep session, like this is like a reunion for me of sorts with some of the folks here, Dave and Mark in particular, and you, Brendan. But one of the things that is interesting to hear when Mark's talking about overtime or Drew's talking about House of Highlights and it's like 5-year run in the media industry, that's really fascinating how young these brands are and how big they've become and the size of the audiences they're garnering. I've been at Barstool 3 years, but Barstool's been in business 17 years. So it's really interesting to see how long of a run Barstool's had and how relevant and culturally relevant it is right now today. One of the things that is at its core, and you just mentioned, is gambling. So Dave started the company, originally to be about sports betting. That's his passion. It's always been a through line in all of our content. It's partly why he's been so relatable to the average sports fan, is because, if they're betting on sports and they're calling their bookie on the weekends, like that is what Dave has always been doing as part of the content. It's what's made it so engaging. So that's obviously a huge focus of what we're doing now, obviously with sports betting becoming legalized in the US and Penn National investing in Barstool and us launching the Barstool Sportsbook. But even beyond that, you mentioned we have shows that don't even touch on sports. We have, pop culture and entertainment shows, women's and men's lifestyle programs that are really entirely outside of the realm of sports. And then some of those personalities do cross over into sports. So you have a great example is Chicks in the Office, which is essentially like a modern day version of E! News. And it's, Rhea and Fran talking about what's going on tonight's episode of The Bachelorette, but also, what's going on in celebrity and pop culture. And then Fran, can turn around and this year launch a new football show with Casey Smith, who is a former, sports broadcaster, come to Barstool to become a sports broadcaster here. And they're launching a new NFL show called Dime Package. So, our personalities can have multiple passion points, and Barstool gives them that flexibility to be able to talk about all of that on our platform and not just be sort of like one swim lane in terms of what people's interests are. So for us, it's like, you don't have to turn the channel from, sports broadcast to pop culture. It's like, you come to us for all of it.
Right. And we talk to brands all the time about passion points. And it sounds like in terms of, people aren't just passionate about a brand. Let's say it's a shampoo, right? Somebody who likes shampoo may also love music, they may love food. And how do you use those things to speak with them better to make them more relatable to your brand? You guys do an excellent job at that. Drew, I want to throw it to you quickly because you do have highlight rights, and that comes through ownership by Turner. How do you use highlights on social, mix that with sort of the digital native content to engage fans? As we probably start to see maybe live sports viewing by younger fans start to decline, how do you use that to your advantage?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it goes back to just being responsive to what your fans are telling you that they want to see more of, right? So like, I think in the early days, so much of the account's content mix was just highlights from live broadcasts. And then over time, what we're able to do is really listen to the feedback that we're getting, both from like public comment sections, but also from thousands and thousands of DMs a day, to understand how to refine what we're bringing the audience and not just kind of continue with more and more highlights, but to kind of widen the aperture to hit on more and more of what Gen Z likes to consume. So going back to the sports culture points that Deidre was hitting on is, you know, whereas we were probably in the 90% range of content mix just being purely highlights 3 years ago, we're now closer to 50-50 almost between whether it be user generated content, original content, mixed with highlights from basketball and other sports as well. And that's because of what we were getting back from the audience that wanted to see more in the way of gaming or music or sports culture or athlete lifestyles, and kind of widening that definition of what a highlight is, I think has become a really important kind of calling card of House of Highlights. It's not just highlights that are happening on the court. It's things that are happening off the court, on the bench, on the bus, whether that's a professional athlete's bus or a middle school or high school bus going to a practice or a game. And so much of that is coming from social listening. So I think Mark touched on this earlier as well, but a couple of years ago, the majority of what people were focusing on were the comment section, right? It was seeing the sentiment that's coming in the comment section of Instagram posts. But something that doesn't get talked about enough is how much of Instagram engagement has gone the way of the DM and even like saved content. So whereas people might be looking at a House of Highlights post and see a couple of thousand comments, the majority of the insight or the most valuable engagements a lot of times that we're seeing are coming through DMs, right? And that's a user making the decision to share a piece of content with their friends. And we're seeing DMs oftentimes 10, 20, 30 times more than comments. And that's the most informative thing that we can have. That's almost that, encouraging cycle that's telling us, oh, the audience is liking the Call of Duty clips. The audience is liking more and more of the Fortnite clips or the musician athlete crossover clips. And that kind of allows us to go into it with a more informed approach, as opposed to just deciding on our own what we think the audience might want more of.
Yeah, that instant feedback seems to be really important, and we'll touch on that. We'll touch on the component. Mark and Dave, I want to get to you guys quickly because I want to talk about athletes and talent. And Dave, you and I have had really significant conversations around how the platforms are being used by athletes to really showcase their own voice and really do things like product launches and tie-ins with brands. Can we expect more and more of that from athletes, whether they're professional or, Mark, we'll talk to you in a second about sort of high school athletes? Is that something we should expect more of?
Yeah, I believe that this is only going to continue, and probably at a more accelerated rate. We've seen this sort of disintermediation between the fan experience and the athletes that they like to follow. With 500 million fans on sports fans on Instagram, the average sports fan follows upwards of 8 different athletes, and so that is a direct connection between the athlete and the very people who are following them and wanting to get deeper into who those people are on and off the field. And so, as we continue to look forward at both the future of how athletes are leveraging social and digital, and then you also think about some of the tools and product offerings that not just Instagram but other platforms are also offering. It's how do you give and enable these athletes to develop their own deep personal experience with their fans, and that can be as specific as the ways in which they're able to communicate via interactivity, stickers on stories, or DMs, as I know each of the brands on this call represent. But even things like shopping, where again, yes, there are partnerships with Nike, Adidas, et cetera, that are incredibly valuable to these athletes. But for the first time ever, really, the sort of democratization of building brands for athletes and actually being able to inspire and transact with the very fans who are interested in them. And so, again, we see this as a trend that's only going to continue. And frankly, as a platform, it's up to us to make sure we are continuing to invest in product development that best serves those kinds of needs, because that need, that opportunity exists far beyond sports. Yes, you can call it an athlete, but you could also call it virtually every public figure and creator on our platform who might have that opportunity as well.
Right. And so it seems like there's a lot of opportunity for brands to get involved there, right? Themselves or the leagues or the teams. We're talking about direct relationships with the athletes in very sort of unique ways, right? Tie-ins to purchasing and things of that nature. Right?
Absolutely. And I think I read the news last week about Overtime partnering with Open Doors, to create something that's honestly incredibly specific to the community that Overtime has built, of not just fans of sport, but also participants of sport. How do they unlock really interesting and unique content opportunities that are both potentially lucrative to the athletes themselves, but also creating engaging content that young fans want to see? And so, again, I think more of those opportunities are going to present themselves as we get more clarity on what an image and likeness looks like, but also, again, as we inherit this sort of headwind of young athletes who are digital natives and endemics and are thinking more so about their personal brands even before they ever step foot into an actual professional league.
Makes sense. So, Mark, I want to go to you. Name, image, likeness, obviously something that's going to be really big. We're talking about high school athletes that are on Overtime, that are walking into college with millions of followers, right, on Instagram or YouTube or wherever it may be. So can you talk a little bit about, what that means for athletes, and hey, is there a possible tie-in rather immediately coming out of high school going into college for brands to associate themselves with a Mikey Williams who has several million followers on Instagram?
Yeah. So first, I'm going to disagree a little bit with Dave, because I just want to have a little bit of fun here. Since everyone's going to agree with each other, I'll decide to spice it up a little bit here. So I do agree with the fact that different athletes are going to be able to go direct to their fans and be able to create really engaging and behind the scenes experiences with their hardcore fans. And I think that is something that Instagram has been a leader in and will continue to be a leader in going forward. The part where I'll disagree a little bit is that outside of, people, the top stars like LeBron, like Steph Curry, who have the tens of millions of followers, and then also have the resources to be able to have their own production companies and to be able to kind of create that sort of depth of content, I do think that partnering with somebody like Overtime to be able to kind of grow their scale and be able to kind of create premium video. And, yes, the word authentic is something that is overused by the media a lot. But I do feel as though fans are more likely to watch content that feels more authentic and not done exactly by the player, because it has more of a sense of, the realness that people, and the rawness of the real access to certain moments that a lot of companies that have set forth to just kind of create content for the athlete have failed at. And so in my opinion, I think that whether it's Overtime, whether it's other media publishers out there, to be able to kind of leverage their premium production resources as well as their distribution will create a more authentic and scaled approach for the athlete. Name, image, likeness is something that is going to be fascinating here, and we're possibly days away from an actual ruling by the NCAA of how they're going to handle it. But yes, I mean, we've seen it, whether it's Mikey Williams, who's a sophomore in high school, he's the top sophomore high school basketball player in the country. He's more relevant to a 13 to 34-year-old than Mike Trout. I joke all the time that Mike Trout, who's the best baseball player that we've seen since Ken Griffey Jr., and as good a center fielder as anyone has seen since possibly Mickey Mantle. Mike Trout could walk into my office, sit down and edit, and 50 of the top sports fans in the country wouldn't know who Mike Trout is. And so when you look at the relevance of these younger digital stars, just like how you have Addison Rae or Charlie D'Amelio, Mikey Williams on the basketball side is every bit as important to that younger sports fan. And that's why, Addison Rae is more popular than, a lot of major actresses amongst the next generation.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how that sort of continued interaction goes. One thing I want to talk about, and we've each touched us, is the fan content that you use or the user-generated content that you use, particularly, let's call it in the last 7 months, as sort of production has had to slow down, you haven't been able to go out. And I'd like you to talk about how important that content has been to you over the course of either the last 7 months or even prior to that. Deirdre, I'll go to you first in terms of using UGC to populate and sort of supplement any original programming that you do. I think it helps bring that fan voice to the platform. Do you agree? And how do you look at it?
Yeah, I mean, Barstool is obviously very well known, as are so many of these other partners here, but, for leveraging UGC viral videos to populate our social handles. We run over 700 different social handles across Instagram and other platforms. And a lot of that is, on a daily basis driven by the user generated content that is submitted to us. And then our ability to kind of contextualize that and put our tone around it through the captions that we're putting on that and the context we put around it. The other thing too that I think we excel at is not just taking viral content and sharing it because it's what fans want to see. I actually think of those viral videos when we talk about like not having highlights, right? So I think of those as our highlights. They're literally like highlights of life. It's actually one of the things that I think fans want to see most of, and I think it's being a little bit deprioritized by Instagram wanting to see more original content from publishers. We're starting to, you still see it on our main channel, like our Barstool main Instagram, a lot more of our original content being produced and published there. And it's performing really well. And, we did very well during the quarantine with Instagram and Instagram Live. And just all the other platforms where we can, set forth live content. But one of the things we do is we instigate our audiences to give us user-generated content to share with us, and then we reshare that so they feel like they're part of the community. Again, going back to being very one-to-one with our fans, being very relatable to our fans, is if they submit, a great example would be, our Pink Whitney vodka product. Our fans will see it in a store, take a photo of it, take a selfie with it, share it back to us, and then we share that on our platforms. They feel like they're part of the content, they're part of the community. So it's incredibly important to us to make sure that we're making fans feel like they're part of the content creation that we're putting out into our different platforms.
Yeah, you've touched on a few things, and I want to get Drew. I want to talk about UGC with you because it's such a core part of what House of Highlights has done. So why don't we just dig in there for a minute, and then I'll get to some of the questions in a couple of minutes that are coming from the audience.
Yeah, totally. I think just going back to your earlier point about, come March, April, during the sports pause, I think people that were, or let's call them publishers or brands that were able to create a consumer expectation for what was to come from their channel, I think were the ones that found success and that were able to actually grow when sports stopped. I think, if we were in a situation where we were only a sports highlight provider to the Gen Z audience, we would have been in a lot of trouble once all live sports stopped. And what we actually saw was larger growth and quicker growth than we had experienced ever before in the channel's history, specifically on Instagram. And a lot of that came on the back of user-generated content. And I think a lot of it is that kind of two-way connection that you have with the audience. I think if you're trying to become, a platform that's publishing user-generated content just by finding it before people, you're gonna have an uphill battle. Whereas I think the relationship that we have with the audience has them, submitting content directly to us because of that hope and that expectation that you can actually be seen on House of Highlights. And not to date myself more than Mark with the Mickey Mantle reference, but I grew up hoping or dreaming of maybe one day being on SportsCenter Top 10. And I think a lot of what House of Highlights has been able to do is kind of democratize that process and almost make it feel a bit more accessible, right? So like if I'm a high school athlete, I can actually have an opportunity to be shown on House of Highlights any day. And I think a lot of that comes with having that one-to-one connection with the people that are making the programming decisions, and being able to send my clip or send my highlight directly to them. And that's I think what's really exciting for teenage athletes and even consumers.
Yeah, I think from
Go ahead, Dave.
just from my perspective, and maybe I'll date myself too, since we're all doing that. But the analogy that I like to give folks, I'm a huge college basketball fan, and if I was on Twitter reading Jay Billis, who's preeminent college basketball writer and personality, if that guy responded to or retweeted anything I would say, what are the first things I'm going to potentially do? I'm going to probably like and engage his content even more, and I'm going to share all that with my friends and family. And so I feel like the concept of UDC is to sort of reinforce that connection between fans and the brands. And Deirdre and I can both attest, working for, at the time, a more emerging B2C brand with Whistle Sports. The fact that we still got a litany of inbound commentary and engagement from fans who understood the programming at the time and the potential for them to get featured in that programming, it just opens up a variety of opportunities, and how you can also create very cost-effective programming that feels like it's aligned with the ethos of those brands. So for UDC, I think we've all noticed, especially from a traditional broadcast perspective, they have jumped on this train, especially over the last 6 months, when essentially the content they're used to programming on social, Instagram, Twitter, et cetera, has gone by the wayside. And these are trends that, again, for the panelists on this group, that their brands have been doing as part of their programming strategies since really day one.
That's awesome. So I think it feels like it's a type of coverage. Mark, let's talk a little. We have lots of brands, lots of brand marketers listening to our discussion right now. When you think about what a brand can do, to what kind of content can it leverage to reach younger audiences, what are we talking about? Is it a mixture of the UGC and the premium? Where are they going? How should they do this? Particularly, let's talk about sports fans.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can leverage both premium and UGC content to be able to tell your brand story. I think a really important thing that I've learned in the last 5 years is really you have to allow the publisher to speak to their audience in the way that they know is going to be successful, right? And so when you do that, like for instance, we've done a number of different things with Converse. We did our own 3-on-3 event that was kind of like a McDonald's All-American game, where they did a shoe launch. And by being able to kind of launch that shoe inside of what our event was, made it so that our community was adopting what they were doing as something that was really impressive. We've seen in our comment section when we've done a bunch of our different shows where people call out, "Oh man, I just tried that new Body Armor flavor. That make sure that you get this one because this one is the best flavor." And so when you allow a brand to kind of play around, allow a publisher to kind of play around with your brand and be able to do it in their authentic voice, it's something where we've seen incredible success and our community really rallying around that product.
Yeah, that's really important to that. We'll use the word authenticity, but it's really just the sort of the voice of the publisher. Deirdre, I want to ask a question that's been asked of you. Obviously, we've seen budgets tighten up in media right now. And so what are you doing to help deliver more value to a brand with the amount of money that they have to spend right now?
Yeah, so one of the things, I've talked a lot about this, but one of the things that we saw was, obviously with sports canceled back during the quarantine, and then the, return to sports being a little bit of a wild west in terms of timing and everything happening at once. Our partners were looking for, well, what is resonating? Like, what are people watching and engaging in? And how can we use, what we know about our audience to help inform their strategy? So, if you are going to try to play it safe and do what you've always done before and wait for that to come back around right now, you're going to find yourself, really stuck. So for us, it was just being able to really quick turn, pivot, and find shows that we had either continued to produce or new shows that were born out of the pandemic, some of them which will live on now into the future, and just look at what our fans are most engaged in, and then help our brands our brand partners understand that and put them in those places. We're also always looking to grow and emerge. Like Dave said something earlier about retired Hall of Famers. I think that's funny given the fact that Barstool Sports most notably recently brought on Deion Sanders, one of our newest personalities, and Deion's reason for coming to Barstool and not renewing his contract with the NFL Network was, he's coaching high school football players. He's coaching his son's team and next year he's going to, be a college level coach.
On overtime, right?
He wants to be in touch with this younger audience, and he wants to be more relevant to younger consumers. And he knows that the guys watching NFL Network already know who he is. He wants to engage new people and get his message across to them. I think that's fascinating. And then you see us on the flip side signing with Josh Richards, who's a very notable TikTok star right now, and launching a podcast with him. So we're playing on both ends of that spectrum. And I think that it's a testament to us that, both very young rising stars and sort of older stars that want to maintain a level of relevance with today's youth are coming to Barstool as a platform to have that voice.
Thanks, Deirdre. Let's talk about athletes, because you brought up Deion, you brought up a few other people. Dave, I want to be across the athlete spectrum in terms of successful sort of sponsorships with athletes on digital. We've talked about sort of athletes taking on partnerships with brands and utilizing them as a platform to promote, but also a purchasing mechanism as well. What do you think are some of the more successful integrations with brands that you've seen with sponsors?
Yeah, in addition to doing sort of the direct to consumer piece we talked about, which for the record, I agree with Mark, not everyone's going to be able to be a Steph Curry and create their own production company. That's, the sort of the top 1%. But I think there are obviously a number of brands who are either proficient in the influencer marketing space and are now understanding that influencer doesn't have to be a digital creator. It can be an athlete, potentially even as young as a high school athlete, depending on how this legislation goes. There are a number of brands we've worked with the launch of some of our tools like Instagram Checkout that understand that the fans of their brand may not necessarily be the same people who are the fans of an athlete, and how do you tap into an athlete's audience, create great stories around things like merchandise. And the example that I don't want to say we most often give, but I think we often cite is around Adidas and how they've leveraged platform tools working with Damian Lillard to do product drops. And you've got Adidas, who's probably got a number of million followers on their platform, Damian Lillard, who does as well. And they are working with Damian Lillard to tell a great story about a product that he's obviously very personally passionate about, but that evokes a level of inspiration in his fan base to subsequently transact with Adidas, who is one of his brand partners. And so we're only seeing those examples continue to grow as brands become more proficient in what the tools are on our platform, and also how athletes start to, or maybe not start to, but continue to realize the value they can have as a partner to these brands using some of these new tools as well. It's not as simple as saying, let me just create a post that looks like specifically like an advertisement and sort of check that box of, okay, I'm fulfilling my brand obligation. It's how do we do something really unique and compelling that my fans are going to enjoy, feels organic to my voice and the things that I would normally post on social, and that can result in driving some meaningful business objective. And so again, you look at the Adidases and the Nikes of the world, but as more and more brands are adopting our commerce tools specifically on our platform, those things are only going to come to the forefront even more.
Yeah, it feels like that content to commerce play is the future of sort of the integration with athletes and brands. And obviously over time, and Barstool and House of Highlights are doing an amazing job of selling merch through content. We've got just 2 more minutes left. Drew, I want to go to you for the last part of this here. When we talk about brand integrations across House of Highlights, give me one that you would highlight as something that you find very successful, and how is that going?
I think to pick one, we've had a really, in-depth partnership with Taco Bell for the last couple of years. And I think what's been incredible about that, going back to what Mark mentioned earlier, is that they've developed a trust with us where they understand that we only have their best interests in mind and want to, create the most organic content to appeal to our audience. And if we're trying to put commercials in the House of Highlights Instagram feed, it's going to stick out like a sore thumb and nobody's going to engage with it. And I think Taco Bell has been one of those brands that has identified what the importance of trusting House of Highlights is, or trusting a brand that has a connection with the audience. Because the tactics that they have on TV or other digital platforms must be inherently different than how they work with us. And what we've been able to do is carve out a night of the week during the NBA season and during the playoffs that is just owned by Taco Bell, and it kind of gives them a deeper connection with our NBA programming. That's not just surrounding highlights or surrounding evergreen content, but it's Thursday nights on Taco Bell, and Taco Bell's owning an Instagram story on House of Highlights, as well as a packaging of other thematic highlights on our timeline. And what I've liked most about it is that they find a way to allow us to create custom interstitials for Instagram story content or Instagram timeline content that shows faces and shows House of Highlights personalities, as opposed to just an ad card. And I think that's made an immense difference in terms of the performance of those campaigns, because they're not just retrofitting the same creative that they've used on other platforms, but instead they're saying, hey, here's the product that we want to get across to the audience. Here's what we want them to remember. How would you guys translate this to a 18-year-old or to a 17-year-old that we want to come away with, remembering that this is the Taco Bell offering? And we've been able to work with, House of Highlights talent like Kenny Beecham and people of the past that have like an actual resonance with the teenagers that we're trying to speak to. And I think that makes all the difference for the advertiser, because they're then associated with both House of Highlights and the creator that they're speaking with.
Okay, that's awesome. So it sounds like we've got a couple of through lines here for the brands. It's really about allowing the public in an organic way. We have direct to consumer with athletes, obviously, and then potentially using user-generated content as a way to speak and connect with the fans through passion points.
Yeah,
does that sound?
Brent, I would just say one more thing too, which is, you look at the three brands on this panel, they are prolific at identifying talent who is going to resonate with a younger audience. And there's a reason that, all these brands are going the way of creating their own in-house agencies to sell the special sauce, which is how do you resonate with young people? And part of that is figuring out talent, both in-house as well as out of house, to do just that. So it's no surprise that, Drew and Deirdre and Mark are referencing people that maybe the average 35 to 40-year-old might not have heard of, but actually is quite resonant with the younger demographic, which, as we know, everyone is trying to reach.
That's awesome. Well, listen, this is really, it's lived up to all the expectations I've had in terms of maybe the best panel discussion of all time, but at least in digital sports, right? So listen, I appreciate it, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it back over to John. Thank you for everybody for joining us online. John, take it away, brother.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Deirdre, Drew, Mark, Deb, and Brendan for an insightful kickoff panel for our first one today around brand storytelling.